Hi, welcome to this APNIC e-learning session on DNS security from the client perspective. My name is Jamie Gillespie. I'm an Internet Security Specialist here at APNIC. So in this session, what we're going to be looking at is different aspects of DNS more from the client perspective as opposed to securing an authoritative or recursive DNS server. So we're going to look at DNS from the beginning through to the end from more of a client end. So what we're looking at is DNS. DNS is the domain name system. It basically converts human readable names such as www.apnic.net into an IP address that is used by the computers to actually do the communication over the internet. Of course, this can be an IPv4 address or an IPv6 address or both at the same time. DNS itself is quite an old protocol. The original RFCs that were creating the DNS system were number 882 and 883. These were written in 1983. There have been some small improvements over time. RFC 1035, as it says, was written in 1987, and this extends DNS to be using TCP as well as UDP. But in essence, the original DNS protocol is still in wide use, and it has some issues that we'll be looking at through here. So looking at a life of a domain name, so even before we get to the DNS servers and clients and requests, we have to have a domain name. So how that starts off is that a registrant, which is yourself either as an individual or as a company, pays money to register a domain with a registrar. Now, you don't technically buy a domain, you're actually just renting or licensing the domain service, although a lot of people do consider it as buying it for a period of time. Now, when you go to a registrar and you say you wish to register a domain name, the registrar will check with the appropriate registry databases to see if that domain name is available or if it's already taken. Assuming that it is available, after you pay your money, the registrar will register the domain name into the registry, and the registry will configure the top-level domain root servers with the DNS server information that you provided so that everybody on the internet knows which DNS servers it is that's going to be serving your requests and the responses for your domain name. So when you look at the registration, it's pretty straightforward, but where can this registration and the registry process go wrong? Well, there's quite a few different ways that we can look at here. The first one is that someone else may have already registered the domain that you are wanting. This may have been with your company name, or it may have been a domain that is similar to your company name that you were trying to register in order to avoid confusion so that people don't go to one domain rather than another. Another one is that somebody may have registered a domain name several years ago within your organization. They may have put for a 3 or 5 year registration period, so you won't need to renew it for 3 or 5 or sometimes even more years. A lot of turnover within organizations, people changing roles, not documenting their processes correctly, can mean that when the registration renewal comes up for your domain name, that it's possible that that will go to an email address that doesn't exist, someone who no longer works for the organization, or people that think that it might be spam or phishing. This may lead to your domain name actually expiring. This will mean that anybody else can then go in and register your domain name and essentially steal it from you. It's not really stealing because you allowed it to expire, but essentially stealing your domain name, and then they can then hijack all of your services. So everything that relies upon your domain name will then be under someone else's control. So they'll be able to redirect all of your VPN traffic, redirect all of your website traffic, and of course, all of your mail server traffic as well. The entire business can be built around this process of finding domains that are about to be expired and then jumping them on them as soon as they're expired to then either hold them and charge more money to the real registrant if they wish to have it back, or to hold on to very lucrative domains using easy to remember names and words. Now, of course, we also have to look at not just the possibility for a domain name to expire, but the possibility for an attacker to break into your registrar account and change your registration details pointing to the attacker's DNS server. So this can happen on any DNS registrar. So what you're looking at is making sure that you have your registrar account as secure as possible. You want to not just look at making sure that you have a long, strong password, but you want to look to see if your registrar provides two-factor or multi-factor authentication to ensure that you have that second factor and an attacker doesn't have to just guess or phish a username and password into your registrar account. The other thing to look at is the old school way of making registrar changes is by sending a fax or a paper letter to the registrar requesting changes to be made. Usually these were done on company letterhead as a simple way of saying that it must be official if it's coming on letterhead from the organization. But creating fake letterhead is quite easy when you can get high quality logos off of the internet quite easily. So you want to look at the security around your registrar registry information and your contact information, as well as your login details from there. Because if an attacker can hijack your domain name at that level, then they can hijack all of the information, websites, mail servers, and everything from there as well. So what we're going to look at now is life of a DNS request. So we've gone through the registration of a domain name. Once you have a domain name, you've set up your DNS servers, and now clients are going to be requesting information. So from a client perspective for a DNS request, the very first thing that happens is the local machine, when it's trying to access, say, www.apnic.net, is that it checks the local cache and the local host file. So does the local computer already have the information it needs to convert the name into the IP address number? If there's no response from that, then the computer will go to its configured DNS resolver. So it sends the request to the DNS resolver saying, I need the IP address for www.apnic.net. Assuming that the DNS resolver doesn't have that locally cached in its system, it will then go to the top-level domains. So for apnic.net, we're looking at the .net, which is the generic top-level domain root servers. It will ask for www.apnic.net, but in reality, it will only respond information for what is that top-level domain, saying, well, it's a .net domain, so this is served by the gTLD servers. So from here, the resolver makes a new connection to the gTLD servers saying, I need the IP address for www.apnic.net, and it will return saying, I don't know about the full address, but I do know that everything ending with apnic.net is served by ns1.apnic.net. The resolver then makes an additional connection to ns1.apnic.net. It says, I want the IP address for www.apnic.net, and it finally returns the IP address. Now, at this point, the DNS resolver will store that locally in its cache in case another request comes in. It doesn't have to go through that whole process. And it returns that IP address to the client computer. Now the client computer can use the IP address to communicate to the website directly, but that's completed the DNS request and response. Now, where can DNS requests and responses go wrong? Well, there's even more ways than how a domain name and a registrar can go wrong. Now, we're going to go through and we're going to look at different problems that can go wrong either intentionally or accidentally with DNS requests. And as we go through this, I want you to look at how things are impacting on the security triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So what we're looking at here is local hosts and client malware. So these are problems that exist on the client computers, on the individual machines that are doing the DNS access. And what we're looking at is malicious software, viruses, trojans, rootkits. They can go onto the local computer and edit the local host file. Now remember, I said that the very first thing for a DNS request is the computer checks the local cache and the local host file. If there's an entry in the local host file, DNS will never communicate to the DNS resolver. It will actually take over control of that local cache, assume that that is correct, and then use that falsified information to connect to a fake website. Additionally, malicious software can change the local DNS settings on the computer to point, instead of to your regular internet provider or corporate DNS resolver, it can point to an attacker's DNS server as the DNS resolver, and then that server can be configured to respond with malicious responses that point off to IP addresses that are under the attacker's control. Now, moving further away from the client computer, we're looking at the problems that happen with DNS resolvers now. So a DNS resolver can have its own issues. The resolver itself can be configured to modify responses and return incorrect information. Attackers can remotely poison DNS resolvers to give false responses. This is particularly possible if the DNS resolver is running older software and has vulnerabilities that allow for this cache poisoning attack to take place. And of course, the DNS resolvers can completely block responses rather than just returning them. So we're not just looking at a blocking or an impact on availability, but we're looking at an impact on integrity of the response, that it could respond with that falsified information as well. So the next one that we're going to look at is the fact that classical DNS requests, especially the ones using UDP, are not encrypted and are essentially having privacy as if they were written on a postcard going through the regular postal mail. So the example here from this little graphic is a postcard addressed to the DNS resolver from your local computer saying, what is the IP address for www.apnic.net? Everyone can read that on the way through. It could even be modified on the way through, but most importantly, the response coming back can be read and modified if there was an attacker sitting in the middle of that connection. So what we're looking at here is the connection from the client computer to the DNS resolver, and both directions, that information unencrypted allows the information to be read. This can be read by the local network operator that's operating the connection from the client computer to the DNS resolver, as well as by the upstream internet provider that would be closer to the DNS resolver or a recursive resolver beyond there as well. So the next problem that we're going to look at is denial of service attacks. Now, denial of service attacks very classically have been targeting websites. It takes down the public image of an organization or takes down the website for an organization where they make their money. You can have denial of service attacks that can actually attack the domain name system as well. If you take a distributed denial of service attack, you can overwhelm a DNS resolver. If the DNS resolver goes away, then the entire internet will appear to be inaccessible from the client's perspective. If the DDoS attack is then attacking the authoritative name server, so in this example here, ns1.apnic.net, if that server is overwhelmed and can't return valid responses, then it will appear that that entire domain is offline. So attacking different types of DNS servers will have a different view from that client perspective, but one way or the other, this is definitely impacting on the availability of these services and the access of the client computer to access those services as well. Now, if we look back at the three concepts that we're looking to protect, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, we also have to look at how we can defend against the attacks on these systems. So in a very simple term, confidentiality can be protected by using layers of encryption. The encryption will protect the information so that it can't be read and maintains that confidentiality. For integrity, we can use cryptographic hash functions. This allows for an independent verification to make sure that the information being returned from the DNS system is the information that is authoritative and hasn't been modified along the way. And of course, for availability, introducing redundancy. Redundancy is a very popular way for ensuring availability of many different services. DNS inherently has a lot of redundancy available to it as long as it's configured correctly. So let's go through these different aspects and look at the ways that we can make DNS more secure. So looking at the encryption side of things for confidentiality, you can look at implementing DNS over TLS or DNS over HTTPS. These are two relatively new, in the production sense, new ways of doing that encryption or doing DNS requests. And instead of using your classical port 53 connections going over the internet, what you have is layers of encryption. Sometimes these are working on different port numbers, sometimes these are working on standard 443, but one way or the other, it's encrypting or modifying the communication so that there are those layers wrapped around it, as shown in the diagram here. And this provides confidentiality for both the request and the response. There is still some small leakage of information because the client computer is talking to the DNS resolver, but the actual request being sent inside of there is completely hidden and protected. Looking for the integrity side of things, what we're looking at is cryptographic hashes. Cryptographic hashes as implemented in DNS is DNSSEC. And APNIC has separate training courses and videos around what is DNSSEC, as well as how to correctly configure and implement DNSSEC. As with a lot of encryption and cryptographic hashing, if not implemented correctly, it can actually cause a self-denial of service on your own domain and your own DNS system. So you want to make sure that you do think through how to deploy it, but once it is deployed, it does allow for that extra level of integrity check and verification. So the DNSSEC integrity checking ensures that responses are coming from the true authoritative domain server and that it hasn't been modified along the way. Now for this verification and checking, there's no layer of encryption on DNSSEC. It's just providing the cryptographic hashing to confirm that nothing has been modified. So when we look at the previous one that we were looking at DNS over TLS and DNS over HTTPS, they provided the encryption for the connection from the client computer out to the DNS resolver. And then DNSSEC is adding a different layer of security looking at protecting the integrity. So the two of those things can actually work well together. One does not completely replace or usurp the other. And then, of course, looking at availability. Making DNS secure for redundancy is quite simple, and that involves deploying additional servers. Deploying additional servers, though, you have to make sure that those servers are protected against individual denial of service attacks. And you also want to try and geographically spread those DNS servers. So if there is an attack, that attack can be localized. So operating multiple authoritative domain name servers protects the availability of your domain name. Ooh, where did I go? There we go. Protects the availability of your individual domain name against denial of service attacks, or at least makes it harder to do denial of service attacks. This will also allow you to do maintenance downtime, where you can do upgrades and modifications to individual servers without taking the entire domain offline, and allows for faster response times if spread out geographically. Additionally, if you spread your DNS servers geographically and use Anycast for the IP addresses, that will allow for a better spread of DDoS attack mitigation as well, as those attacks will be localized to the closest DNS server, not just to the DNS servers that you've defined. And of course, to help make DNS secure, you can't forget about the endpoint computers. This is not just about the network communication, but remember, one of the first attacks that we were looking at was talking about malicious software and viruses that can make modifications to the endpoint computer. If that is allowed to happen, then no layers of protection, whether it be DNS over TLS or HTTPS or implementing DNSSEC, none of those things will help you if the local computer has been poisoned by malicious software, modification of host files, or changing of your DNS server settings themselves. So don't forget the basics. Make sure that you have anti-malware and antivirus software installed. Make sure it's enabled. Make sure it's being updated and can't be disabled by the users. Make sure that the users are not running with local administrative privileges. This is important because if a virus gets onto a computer and the user was logged in as a local administrator, the virus will also have permissions as the local administrator, meaning that it can make all system changes and even hide itself from the user completely. As an administrator, it may even have the permissions to disable antivirus software or the updates, therefore persisting and keeping the virus active on the machine for longer. And you also want to make sure that you update your operating system and applications, as those are common vulnerabilities that allow for attackers and malicious software to gain access into your systems as well. There's also some different DNS protection techniques for endpoints, and these even apply for Internet of Things or IoT devices as well, and I'll talk about that in a sec. What you can do is you can configure your own DNS recursive resolver server using RPZ. Now, RPZ stands for Response Policy Zones, and this allows you to configure a list of domain names in your DNS server that should not be resolved. Now, you may think that this is an easy way to do blocking for sites that you wouldn't like, such as gambling or pornography within a corporate workplace, but you can also bring in lists of malicious domain names. These are domain names that are used by DDoS botnets and command and control, can also be used for other types of malicious call home and remote access Trojan software as well. Now, this is something that you would do on your own DNS resolver server. There is instructions. If you do a Google search for DNS RPZ, you can find a lot of information on how to set this up. You can set it up on both Linux and Windows DNS servers. And there's also free and paid sources of information where you can get feeds of domain names, so you don't have to manually configure in which domains are malicious and should be blocked. You can bring in these feeds from more authoritative security sites. Now, if you don't have access to configure your own DNS RPZ, say that you're doing this in a small office environment where they don't run their own domain server, or you're looking at protecting even your home network with IoT devices at home, what you can do is you can use a public DNS server that has RPZ enabled already. Some of these are free and some of these are paid. OpenDNS, that was purchased and incorporated into the Cisco umbrella product, is a very popular paid version, and it's very configurable as well. On the free side, the example I mentioned here is quad9.net. It is a free DNS RPZ server. It can't be configured, but it blocks malicious websites. It only blocks malicious websites. It doesn't block anything else, such as pornography or gambling or other sites that are inappropriate for different environments. So you can be assured that when you put it in, the only thing it's blocking is sites used for remote access Trojans, DDoS botnets, and command and control servers. This is quite interesting, as you can actually apply these DNS settings onto your IoT devices. Where you configure the IP address, you can configure a DNS server as well, or you can configure it on your DHCP server so that your IoT devices will get this type of, say, Quad9, for example, as their DNS server. A lot of IoT devices have vulnerabilities in them, or vulnerabilities will be discovered in the future. Even some of the large name smart TV manufacturers will only provide software updates for a TV for a certain period of time, which is usually a lot shorter than the total lifetime for the device. So it may be that your TV at home connected to the internet may have vulnerabilities that are being found but are no longer being patched. If the unfortunate thing were to happen that your IoT device, such as a smart TV, were to be compromised by malicious software, it will attempt to do a DNS query, usually, to communicate back to a command and control server. That will mean that if you're using something like Quad 9 or an RPZ server, your smart TV with malicious software installed will not be able to do the DNS request, will not get the response, and therefore not connect to the command and control server to join into a DDoS botnet. So you can see how this DNS RPZ is quite useful for the end user devices as well. That said, it is still best if you can get software updates to apply the updates and the patches, as that's the definitive way to close off known vulnerabilities. So in conclusion, as I say, this was a relatively short introduction to DNS. We're looking at domain names. We're looking at the registration process. Domain names in DNS are a lot more complex than most people think. A lot of people will forget some of the aspects, especially around the registration services. And if you can register a domain for 3 or 5 or even 10 years, it's very easy to lose track of a domain name and lose track of what username and password you're using on your registrar. Additionally, not all registrars are supporting two-factor and multi-factor authentication. Another thing to look at is the fact that with complexity with DNS systems, there comes risk. And if you don't understand the complexity, then you may not understand the risks involved as well. You want to make sure that you identify all the gaps in your systems, as well as your digital supply chain, such as the supply chain of purchasing new domain names and registering them, and your DNS systems. And of course, defense in depth is still a very strongly promoted security strategy, and this is even for low-level infrastructure. Defense in depth is not just about your servers and your workstations, but we're looking at individual components of them, as well as some of the servers that don't have a lot of user interaction, such as your DNS resolvers. And that is the conclusion for this workshop. I'd like to thank you very much for spending your time with me today. As a reminder as well, this as an introduction session, there are other training courses that APNIC has scheduled into the future, as well as ones we've run in the past that have been recorded. If you're interested in learning more about DNSSEC and securing DNS servers, please look through the training website for APNIC and the Academy. Again, thank you very much for your time, and I hope to see you again in the future.